Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the new Viltrox AF 9mm F2.8 from their Air series. I'm filming on it right now and will be doing so for all of these outdoor segments. I came to you a week ago with a review of the 14mm F4, which was for full frame, and now we have what is essentially the sister lens to that one, the 9mm F2.8 for APS-C. Viltrox has done something unique in that essentially they have engineered a wide-angle prime lens and then have delivered both a full frame and then an APS-C variation of it. That's not to say that these lenses are identical. They're not quite the same angle of view. They have slightly different strengths and weaknesses, but you can certainly tell a commonality of design for them. And in both cases, what we have is extremely competent wide-angle prime lenses that go very, very wide. In this case, 113.5 degrees of coverage and a lens that is very, very compact and only weighs 175 grams. That makes for a very intriguing wide-angle option for both video and stills. And today we're going to explore whether or not this lens that you can get for under 200 bucks should jump all the way to the top of your list if you're looking for a wide-angle prime for your APS-C camera. We'll dive in and let's take a look together. Today's episode is sponsored by the all-new Fantom Tracker 2.0. Fantom has not only seriously upgraded the visual look of the card, but now we have a superior build quality made with tempered glass and metal alloys. This credit card size tracker can be locally tracked via a 90 decibel beeping noise, but also on a global level via Apple's Find My Network and its map. The addition of NFC means that you can also use the card to trigger an automation. Just tap it. The tracker fits perfectly in any wallet or bag and assures you won't lose your valuables. It has a built-in rechargeable battery that can be easily charged via any wireless charger, and a single charge can last up to 6 months. The Fantom Tracker 2.0 makes for a seriously cool gift, so visit store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 at checkout for 20% off. That's store.fantomwallet.com and use code Dustin20 for 20% off. So in disclosure, this lens was sent to me by Viltrox for evaluation. As always, however, this is a completely independent review. Viltrox has had no input on my findings, nor will they see this video before you do. So because this is an APS-C lens, it is available in one additional mount as compared to the 14mm f4. So I've reviewed it here in Sony E-mount. However, it's also available for Fuji X-mount as well as Nikon Z-mount. As you can see, and from the specifications, these two lenses are literally the exact same size. They are both 65 millimeters in diameter, 2.55 inches by 56.4 millimeters, or 2.22 inches in length. They both have 58 millimeter front filter threads, and the APS-C lens is just a hair heavier. The 14mm f4 weighs in at 170 grams, whereas the 9mm f2.8 weighs in at 175 grams. That's for Sony E-mount and Fuji X-mount. It's a little heavier at 190 grams in Nikon Z-mount, and that, of course, is due to the fact that Z-mount is considerably wider in diameter, and so there's some extra lens near the lens mount. If you look at the rear of the lens, it does have Viltrox's signature USB-C port there, but what it doesn't have is any kind of weather sealing gasket. It does have an HD nano coating on the front element to help to protect that. However, that's the only nod to weather sealing that we have got here. It does include both the lens hood and a pouch, and the lens hood, it's identical to the one that's included on the 14mm f4. It locks on into place nicely and clicks into place with good tightness and precision there. The aperture iris is made up of 7 blades, and as you can see here, stop it down a bit, and it does produce a decent looking 14-pointed sunstar. I think the 14mm f4 is just a little bit cleaner because the blades look just a little bit more defined, but it's nice enough to add a little bit of pizzazz to your images, like this shot with a bridge here. I think it adds a little bit to that. Now, when it comes to minimum focus distance, on paper, both lenses are capable of focusing as closely as 13 centimeters. So technically, according to the specifications, the 9mm has a 0.15 times magnification, while the 14mm has a 0.23 times magnification. That comes again because of that difference in focal length. And so in this case, 9 millimeters, when you multiply that by the 1.5 times crop factor of the various cameras, that's a 13.5 millimeter full frame equivalent. And so it's a nicely wide lens. But because you have to multiply that focal length figure by that by that 1.5 times crop factor, you have to do the same here when it comes to the maximum magnification. So on paper, that would mean that it's basically the equivalent of the 14 millimeter lens. But to my surprise, I was actually able to get a higher level of magnification with the lens. Now, when I test on my lens chart, I actually use manual focus and make sure to crank it to the furthest limit that the lens will go. So what that means is that maybe I was able to get a little bit closer than 13 centimeters. Maybe it only autofocuses down to 13 centimeters, but if you manually focus, you can get a little bit higher magnification, because I would estimate the full frame equivalent magnification level of being closer to 0.30 times. Bottom line is that I could fill a good part of the frame even with these AirPods, for example, in a case. And so definitely there's a very usable amount of magnification there. And up close performance is good, not like macro level good, but quite good, but you're not going to get a completely flat plane of focus either. Overall, however, as with all of these Air series lenses, which are very predictable in what you're going to get, there's no bells and whistles, there's no switches, there's no aperture ring. The manual focus ring moves nicely with good damping, but that's pretty much it. They're simple, but they are tough. They can take drops and knocks without showing any kind of marks, and they stay centered. And so if you're just looking for a lens that functions, the Air series works great. So let's talk autofocus. As per usual with the Air series lenses, we have an lead screw type STM focus motor. Now in this case, it being a very wide angle of view, it means that focus doesn't have to work quite as hard, because with wide angles of view, that means a lot tends to be in focus at a time. That being said, however, autofocus is nice and snappy, with near instantaneous transitions from close to distant subjects and back. It also has very good confidence in those transitions, locking on without hesitation. And in my test, it delivered very good focus accuracy. In fact, I was able to track with a fairly decent success bees coming in and out of the hive, and you can see from this shot, for example, that there is plenty out of focus in both the foreground and the background. And so that tells you that focus did have to be at the right place to deliver this kind of result. And that means also with these shots of Ferrari, for example, that a more slowly moving subject, no problems there. Autofocus accuracy was excellent, and whatever I was shooting, I was able to lock on to quickly and deliver well-focused results. That's pretty much all I can ask for from any lens. I would say that video autofocus is equally important in a lens like this, as I see this as being a natural lens for a lot of you to use for a variety of different purposes, whether it be on a gimbal where it's small and lightweight and allows you more range of motion because the lens is short enough it's not going to interfere with the limits on the gimbal. It also means because it is so lightweight, you might be able to use it on a smaller, thus less expensive motorized gimbal. It's also going to work really well for those of you that might do vlogging, and we'll pause here for a moment and take a look at it from that aspect. Like the 14mm f4, I think that this 9mm f2.8 is going to be a great option for those that are looking for a lens for vlogging. For a couple of reasons. First of all, focus is nice and stable, as you can see here. And then obviously, of course, this is a really fantastic focal length. It's also very lightweight. And so as a byproduct, there's a lot of different things that you could put the camera on and it not be too heavy, and thus become more practical. I also would look at this as being an excellent lens for gimbals for the same reason. Lightweight, wide angle of view, good autofocus, and thus this is a lens I think that for a lot of people could be a very useful tool for your APS-C camera for capturing video content. So as you can see, it has no problem tracking my face and doing everything that you would want from a vlogging type lens. What's more, when I did focus pulls back and forth, those pulls they're very confident, they're accurate, there's no pulsing or settling. It's able to lock on and just do what it needs to do, and you can see that there is only a minimal amount of focus breathing there in the transitions. That meant, because focus was relatively small in those adjustments, that when I did something like my hand test, that as it transitioned back and forth, sometimes I couldn't even tell for sure whether it was actually focusing, moving back and forth. However, when I tried to scrutinize, it seemed like everything was appropriately in focus on either end of the spectrum. So I was happy with that. In other shots, for video work in general, I just got well-focused results without any kind of reservation. So I believe that this is going to be a really solid lens for video work because the focus is confident, it's very quiet, and it's relatively well damped. It doesn't do anything abruptly. That makes it a very competent lens for use on either a gimbal or for vlogging situations, or just in shooting video in general. So let's talk image quality. This optical design is a little bit more complex than the 14mm. It is 13 elements in 11 groups rather than 12 elements in 9 groups for the full frame lens. And so it's also a little bit different in the optics that are there. In this case, we have 3 extra low dispersion elements, 3 high refractive index elements, and 2 aspherical elements. So it's just a little bit different of the optical arrangement there and the way that the elements are used. But you can also see if you look at the MTF that there is a similar optical signature there with similar strengths and weaknesses as you look across it. One of the things that stood out on both of these lenses, which is unique in my experience, and that is that they're actually sharper wide open than what they are stopped down to f8. And so in this case, basically everywhere but the extreme corners, it is sharper at f2.8 than what it is at f8. The good news is that means you're getting lots of performance from wide open, so nothing to complain about there. And I found in real world shots, this is a very sharp wide angle lens that is going to compete with, frankly, with the best options that are out there for APS-C. And some of the other metrics, like the 14mm, again, optically they have a lot of similarities. I found a similar kind of distortion pattern here. And that distortion is low in total quantity, but it is a little bit complex, a little bit of a mustache pattern there. But on the positive side, I only needed a +8 to correct here, whereas the closest similar lens that I have viewed or reviewed in the last maybe 2 years would be a Fujifilm's 8mm F3.5, a lens, by the way, that cost like 4 times as much. And that lens, I needed to use a +25 to correct the barrel distortion compared to using just a +8 here. And it's kind of refreshing, frankly, to review a compact lens that isn't relying on software corrections to make it look good. In this case, they've done most of the engineering there. And so as a byproduct, even without correcting, I felt pretty good about the results I was able to get, whether we're shooting interior spaces where lines don't look distorted, whether it was shooting something like this bridge, and you can see here that it's not like stretching or warping towards the edges. In general, I was pretty impressed by how low the distortion was and thus how low an impact it had, even without correcting it. And of course, Viltrox gets pretty decent profile correction support, and so you're going to have probably no real-world issues with that, particularly when that correction profile is available. Likewise, vignette is moderate. It was right around the +50 range to correct, so around 2 stops of correction. And again, by comparison with the Fuji 8mm f3.5, remember, slightly smaller maximum aperture, I had to use a +75 to correct that lens. So again, I'm impressed by the job that Viltrox has done here in keeping those factors low. And so again, even shooting in an interior space with no corrections in the corner at f2.8, the corners don't look noticeably bad there. I'm sure they would look a little bit brighter if I were to brighten them up, but really it doesn't look bad overall. Likewise, I saw no longitudinal style chromatic aberrations before and after the plane of focus, which is going to help you in getting sharper performance up close as well, where there is a little more shallow depth of field. Likewise, and really important for such a wide angle lens, the corners are quite clean as well, with very little levels of lateral style chromatic aberrations there. Good stuff all across the board. Now, when it comes to resolution, I'm reviewing here on 26 megapixels, which is the highest available on Sony right now. If you are shooting on Fuji in particular at 40 megapixels, you can expect the lens to be a little bit more challenged, but I do think that it is sufficient to the task here. What I found here on Sony is that the crops look great. Center looks good. The mid frame is really holding up well. And as we move out towards even the far corners, it looks good all the way till maybe like the last percentage point of 2. And so it looks really good overall. in real world shots, I found the amount of sharpness available wide open to be really good in a lot of situations. And yes, like the extreme edges are going to be a little bit softer than the center, but still usable even at f2.8. As you stop down a bit, it gets a little bit better at f4. That's mostly noticeable in those corners. And sharpness in terms of consistency across the frame seems to peak at about f5.6. And by f8, I felt like there was a mild regression there. And then by the time you get to f11, diffraction is starting to kick in. And so it's a little bit softer yet. And then by f16, which is the minimum aperture, diffraction is making it the softest that you're going to see at any aperture value. At the same time, it's not so soft as to be unusable. And in many situations, I think you could still shoot at f16, and at just 100% level of magnification, it's going to look okay there. The corners, I would say, never get as pin sharp as the center of the frame, but the corners resolve better than what most wide-angle lenses ever get to. And so I think, again, for this amount of money, you're going to be really delighted by how sharp and high contrast the lens is. For landscapes, it produces beautiful results. Great color, great contrast, and great detail all across the frame. Very, very good results. When it comes to the bokeh side of things, you don't buy a 9mm lens for producing bokeh, but because you can focus so closely, there are situations when you're doing that where you can put the background out of focus. And what I found is that to my eye, the backgrounds were a little bit on the busy side, more outlining and busyness than what I would like. I actually preferred the 14mm out of focus rendering. The 9mm is a really sharp, high contrast lens, and unfortunately, it can't really turn that off in the defocused area. And so, I mean, bokeh is subjective, so you may like the look of what you see here. For my eye, however, it was on the busier side, not my favorite aspect. When it comes to flare resistance I would call mostly good, with just a little bit more ghosting at smaller apertures that will show up a little bit in images, but I wouldn't say to a destructive level. And the ghosting artifacts are small enough that in many situations you might be able to remove them if they bug you, or they're not, for those of you that are maybe less turned off by that, it's not enough to really complain about very much. I certainly have used far more expensive lenses than this that had much more issues with flare. I was also really delighted to find that this lens is a surprisingly strong performer for astro work. And if you are looking for a value lens for shooting astro, this is a really tempting option. It's got such a wide angle of view. It has relatively low vignette in the corners, and star points are really crisp, and there's only a very mild amount of chroma smear towards the edges. And that adds up to a really intriguing combination for under $200. And so I think that is a great application along with this lens. If you are a real estate photographer and you shoot APS-C, this is a great budget real estate lens or architecture lens. Because native distortion is relatively low. Obviously for landscapes, it's got a lot of different applications that it's going to work quite effectively for. And so my overall impression about the optics, I walk away being impressed. I would say that I don't love the bokeh, but again, outside of that, not much to complain about. And as I said, who buys a 9mm lens for bokeh anyway? The Viltrox Air 9mm f2.8 is the kind of lens that we should all want coming to our own system of choice. The combination of its small, compact size, its lightweight, its very wide angle of view, and then its competent autofocus and excellent optical performance makes it a lens that frankly would be tempting even if its price point was considerably higher. The fact that you can get this lens for under $200 makes it even more compelling. For those of you that are shooting on APS-C, whether it be for Sony E-mount, as I've tested here, Fuji X-mount, or Nikon Z-mount, this is a lens that I see no reason why it shouldn't jump to the very top of your list if you're looking for a wide-angle prime. It's very easy to bring along. That field of view is really, really useful, and if you've never used an ultra-wide-angle lens, you'll be pleasantly surprised after you put in a little bit of work into it at the kind of images that you can produce that tend to be more dynamic and exciting than what you can produce with tamer focal lengths. I'm really glad to see Viltrox push out its horizons a bit when it comes to the Air series, because this really is a sweet spot for a lot of photographers. There's really not a whole lot of flaws to point to here. This is a really well executed package, and while it's simple and not feature rich in any way, shape, or form, it really kind of does everything that you need, and most of those controls, while I like to have them on the lens itself, they're pretty easy to do from within the camera also. So at the end of the day, I think that if you are looking for a wide-angle prime, there's not a lot of reasons to spend more money than this, because this lens is just so competent. Now, if you want more information, you have a couple of options. You can either check out my full text review that is linked in the description down below on the newly redesigned DustinAbbott.net. Go check that out there and check out the website while you're there. Also, I will dive into the optics in a little bit more detail in just a moment for those of you that want a deeper dive. Let's take a look at that together. So first of all, this is a nicely wide focal length. As you can see here, for such a compact lens, you have a really wide angle of view, and so looking down towards my feet, they look a long ways away. You can also see that the 9mm on APS-C is clearly wider than what the 14mm is on full frame. And so you can see that this phone, for example, is almost clipped off, whereas there's some more space on this side. If we look down towards this arm of the love seat, you can see that there's more of it in view here on the APS-C lens. And so it gives you a really nice, nearly 114-degree angle of view. Now also, good news when it comes to the quantity of the distortion here. You can see that distortion is very mild to where most of those lines look relatively straight. There is a little bit of that mustache pattern, as you can see, so if I try to correct the inner lines better, it actually does create some pincushion distortion out at the edge, unfortunately, but the correction profile will do a better job of that. Right around plus 50 to correct for the vignette in the corners, so no big deal on either one of those fronts. Perhaps most importantly, in most real-world situations, I think you can get by without having to correct distortion, profile aside. You can see that in all of these various lines, there's lots of straight lines in this, and they still look straight. They're not really distorted. Likewise, here with this bridge, you can see that the lines are staying straight on that without it starting to squeeze or warp at any point. And so for most, I would say probably 99% of applications, the distortion is low enough that you're probably not going to see it in real-world images. Likewise, if we go back to this image for a moment, the vignette is not so severe as to really cause any kind of noticeable issues. Not to say that it's perfect, obviously, but you can see here in these corners, there's no corrections here. Vignette really isn't dominating this image. And so yes, you could lighten up those edges and it would make a difference, but this is a perfectly usable image right out of camera. No issues with longitudinal style chromatic aberrations. You can see the contrast is nice and high with no apparent fringing before or after the plane of focus. Likewise here in the edges, when it comes to lateral style chromatic aberrations, there is a tiny amount there, but frankly, it's not enough that you're going to actually see it in real-world applications. So when it comes to overall contrast and resolution, again, this is a Sony, so it's 26 megapixels for APS-C. This is 200% level of magnification. Obviously, the 40 megapixels on Fuji, it's going to be a little bit more demanding, but as you're going to see, it has no problems here on Sony, and it should do well on Fuji as well. Here in the center of the frame, it looks fantastic. Super sharp, very high contrast. Mid-frame looks excellent. As we pan down here, we can see that there's very little drop-off from this corner to this corner as we move towards the edge of the frame. You can see that moving right off to here, it's still looking very good. Maybe just a little bit of muddiness in that final bit of degree, but overall it is holding up in terms of resolution really well, really right towards the corners. So that means even wide open here in this shot, f2.8, and this is at 100% magnification, a more typical kind of real world. You can see that there's plenty of detail all across the frame, everywhere that we look, lots of information there. Likewise in this shot, this is f2.8, it's dimmer lighting conditions here under the trees, but you can see detail is looking really nice in the image. No problem, you can shoot f2.8 with very little penalty. Even in this shot, where I was able, because I was up higher on a bridge, to get a little bit flatter plane of focus, which is always a challenge with a lens like this. It's with such a wide angle of view. Here at f2.8, you can see right off to the very edges of the frame that, it's down here might be a tiny bit affected by depth of field, but overall, I would say everywhere that I look, even at f2.8, there is still a very usable amount of detail and contrast. And so this is an image, or this is a lens that holds up very well at f2.8. Now, as is the case with a lot of lenses that are very sharp wide open, there's not a whole lot in addition to be found as you stop the lens down. There is very slightly more contrast here at f4 in the center of the frame. Here in the mid frame, again, you can see with the writing here and here, there is a little bit of progress there. And as we pan down, we can see towards the corners. The corners are very slightly better. It's starting to resolve a little bit more, like in this area. The contrast is a little bit better there. We look up into the upper left corner, you can see that there is a little bit of improvement from here to here. And if we look at this insignia here, it is just a little bit more well delineated as you stop the lens down. We can also see that centering is very good. As we pop over here to the upper right corner, all the corners are looking good. There's a bit more gain from f4 to f5.6, and I think here you're really kind of getting the peak performance across the frame. It's looks very slightly better. It's not a big improvement, but if we move on to f8, we can see that the f5.6, in my opinion, looks just a little bit better than what f8 does there. So look at f5.6 as being your peak performance, like for landscapes with this lens. Here's a shot at f5.6, for example, and you can see that everywhere you look in the frame, off in the edge here, across the center of the image, off to the left corner here, everywhere you look, there's just great detail and contrast throughout the image. If we step back and look at the image as a whole, it looks really good. Likewise, at f8, I think this kind of gives you a sense of the dynamic type of images that you can produce with such a wide angle of view. So great detail and contrast in the image, and just the whole kind of vibe of it has a lot of power to it. Diffraction will start to cause some softening by f11, and it's slightly more pronounced by f16, but as you can see, it's not radically different. At 100% magnification, this would still be very usable. As you've probably been able to see in these images, colors are also really nice. Their optical glass is good, even in this inexpensive Air series. So you can see detail and contrast looks really good all across this marina, right off to the edge, and nice levels of color saturation in the images without anything looking garish or overblown. As we've seen, we're able to get a higher level of magnification than what the specs indicate. You can see here that while the plane of focus isn't perfectly flat, in the area where it is in focus, detail and contrast actually look really nice, which is going to allow you to get better up-close images. You can get good enough detail here to see how dirty the AirPods are here, but you can surprisingly fill a pretty good part of the frame with this very small subject. Now, as noted earlier, I think that the bokeh, to my taste, is a little bit on the busy side. This is kind of best case scenario where you can get really close to your subject and then your background is some distance away, but you can see there is some outlining there. This image where it's a little bit less favor ratio, it's busy to my eye. There's just a lot of hard edges there and a little too much of outlining there. And so, I mean, obviously bokeh is a subjective thing, but I certainly wouldn't buy this lens for its bokeh rendering. Flare resistance is kind of a mixed bag. It's mostly good. Contrast holds up well, but in certain images like this, I feel like if the sun in certain conditions can be a little bit dominant with these light rays starting to come out, a better scenario is here where the sun is up at a kind of a higher arc, and so as a result, it's a little less dominant to the image itself. Finally, when it comes to chroma, I was really pleasantly surprised here. The star points, as you can see, they're really, really nice and crisp. So that's great. There's no fringing on those. And really, the instance of chroma is really quite low. This is about as bad as what you're going to find, which isn't really bad at all. And so star points still look mostly round here towards the edge of the frame. Vignette is relatively low, and you can get lots of stars on frame because of that wide angle of view. And so I actually really like this as a budget astro lens. All in all, it's pretty sweet. And so as you can see from the deep dive of the optical performance, this is a lens that does a lot of stuff well, and it really doesn't have many flaws. Hopefully the optical deep dive has helped you to determine whether or not this is the lens that you've been looking for. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.